is Oromo Voice Radio English program. Oromo Voice Radio is broadcasting to Oromia at 16-meter band or 17,850 kilohertz or on oromovoice.org website. OVR broadcasts Oromia Insight program every Monday for 15 minutes at 7:15 p.m. Oromia local time. Welcome to Oromia Insight program.
Oromia is a country in East Africa well known as the Horn of Africa. It's 600,000 square kilometers, making it larger than France, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Oromia is populated by over 40 million people. It's the origin of human race and the Gada system. Oromia is the birthplace of coffee and home to world-class athletes. Also is a nation with multi-faith society, Christianity, Islam, and Waqf. Oromia is the third largest single nation in Africa and the single largest nation in East Africa. It has been occupied by Ethiopia for over 130 years and is struggling for self-determination. Oromia has unaccounted number of Oromo refugees living in other countries.
Welcome to Oromia Insight. My name is Aliye Geleto. This is part 2 interview with Tsegaye Ararssa from University of Melbourne about how the Ethiopian state formed and sustained itself for this long.
Proposed this as an education policy of the country, and the Oromo has always been whose identity was rejected in Ethiopia, whose language is denigrated, whose culture is dehumanized, and to exist as an Oromo subject in Ethiopia was made impossible. So Oromos should take up an Amhara name. Oromos should speak Amharic. Even in the churches in the Oromo territory, people were preached to through Amharic language, when there is actually no one who understands the language, and so on and so forth. The I Am Oromo First movement of the last few years, one of the things that it was basically saying is resisting that policy of imposition of another identity, which is an Ethiopian identity. It was more than even resistance, it's a reclamation of who the Oromo person is. Because the Oromo person knew themselves as Oromos first and foremost, although they were made to deny that and to identify themselves as Ethiopians first. Of course, there is a motto that said Ethiopia first during the 1974 revolution. Immediately after the 1974 revolution, the Derg regime at the time had this motto which says Ethiopia first, because they knew that there were different insurrections and different resistance movements in Eritrea, in Oromia, in the Somali region, and so on and so forth. So in order to submerge that, they had been preaching this gospel of Ethiopia first. So the I Am Oromo First movement was a reaction to that, and they were basically saying, look, I am going to reclaim who I am on my own terms. I am an Oromo first, and that's what I am. So that's how, in a way, it's a resistance, it's a talking back to the imposition that was going on, the cultural assimilation that was going on for almost a century.
A state built on contradiction run by playing one against the other, will it allow to continue to survive?
Well, the state has a very fundamental violence. It claims the fundamental contradiction. The contradiction is because it says it's a vast country called Ethiopia, but at the same time it says this Ethiopia is Abyssinia. Now, you can't have it both ways. If you are Ethiopia, then you are far more than Abyssinia. And this is the fundamental tension within the imperial state form. The nation-building process to form all these diverse peoples into the Ethiopian mosaic has not succeeded for various reasons. Because of resistance, because of the relatively weak imperial position of the Abyssinians, etc. It just couldn't happen. Now, the state that was inaugurated with violence, with military conquest, was sustained through military force over time, because they never succeeded in creating one nation out of many. So there were many nations in Ethiopia, some of them suppressed by others. So it was only a matter of time until that nation that was built on violence would finally come to collapse. This contradiction reached its apogee in 1991 when the Derg regime collapsed, in spite of the fact that it had the largest military in sub-Saharan Africa, almost 500,000 army, and probably Ethiopia's state was the biggest at the time, but in spite of its large size of army and equipment, it collapsed in 1991. The collapse of the state in 1991 was the result of the implosion of the state under the contradictions that it was born with and sustained by.
The state in Ethiopia is a terrorist. It is foundational terror. It is founded on terrorization of the civilian population. It is founded the full hills of genocide, extermination, and dispossession, and the dislocation. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, the Ethiopian state that was formed in the 1900 was the result of expansion. The state drew its legitimacy from force and, of course, from religion, because the emperors in Ethiopia were elects of God, quote-unquote, and from genealogy. You have the right to rule only if you are born into a particular Amhara Tigrayan family that claims its descent from King Solomon, King David of biblical Jerusalem. So that state was fundamentally a violent state. And the violence was expressed in many ways. There were atrocities perpetrated on the other peoples of Ethiopia, including the Oromo, in the 19th century. And the atrocities took the form of genocide, massacres, as you know, in Oromia, the Harmamura and the Arkamura, where people's limbs and people's breasts have been amputated. Gruesome kinds of massacres. Thousands were massacred, or sometimes on a daily basis. Thousands were enslaved, and slavery was in existence up until in actual fact, up until 1974, but legislations were there to abolish slavery in the 1930s, and people have been displaced through the formation of the garrison towns, which we call cities, the Katama. Local cultures were reduced to nothing. People were forced into cultural amnesia. They were forced to forget their local indigenous names. They were forced to take other names, and their history was erased. It's like the people of the South never had history. They were people without history. The Ethiopian history is the history of the North, the Amhara Tigrayan history. So all these forms of violence, the erasure from history, the denigration of culture, the dehumanization of the Southern person as a subject, the enslavement of the peoples of the South and the Western periphery, in particular, the darker-faced peoples of Benishangul Gumuz and Gambela, and the Deep South in the South Omo area. Considering all this and the continued violence on their culture, on their subjectivity, and on their human identity, and on their territory, the forests were devastated, by the way, by the resettlement projects, by the Naftanya army that went to the south. The ecology was completely devastated. And this was a terrorist state. If this is not a terrorist state, a state that terrorizes a civilian population completely unarmed, a state that amputates women and children, I don't know what is a terrorist really. And it was this violence that was done in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, up until today, in the form of an organized military and police force and prison centers and incarceration centers, vast incarceration centers or concentration camps, as we call them, in Oromia, like that Edessa, Hurso, these places, Shoarobit now, Zuai, Bati, all these places in Oromia. They do it in this manner now, in a more modernized, technologized form, and so we don't realize its terroristic nature. It is an act of state now for us. Otherwise, it's the same violence that used to be perpetrated, that is being perpetrated now, and it is a terrorist state. In fact, I always give this example to my students. When an Ethiopian sees a member of a federal police or people in the uniform on the streets, do they feel a sense of security or do they feel a sense of fear? That's what I ask my students. And obviously, if you are walking in Ethiopia, if you see a number of military officials or federal police forces or anyone in the uniform, the first question you would ask each other is there any problem around here? It is not like, there are law enforcement people, so we are okay. That's not how we feel. So the presence of people in the uniform in Ethiopia, the presence of anyone from the state bureaucracy it signals terror. That is quite symptomatic of the terroristic nature of the state in Ethiopia.
You compare 2015 and 1915, which is 100 years gap, I think. What is the similarity in 1915 and 2015?
Yes, I did this comparison in the context of the election that is happening this year, election 2015. And I tried to draw a parallel between 2015 and 1915. In 1915, the Ethiopian state was as insecure as it is today. So in 1915, there was a lot of interest in making new laws, new modern laws, to help secure the state, to help vanquish resistance. In 1915, the state was still struggling to build one nation out of many. In 1915, the state still was looking for a new ideology of legitimation. In 2015, the state is as insecure as it was in 1915. There is still a resistance movement, and there is still even a military resistance to the state, and there is civil resistance in the form of political protest within the state. The contradictions still exist. The attempt to build one nation out of many continues, although the government in power seems to be a pluralistic one, which says that it has premised the country on a different logic. Instead of building it by using the e pluribus unum motto, which is one out of many, they are saying we are going to keep many in one, plures in uno. That's why they have got federalism. That's why they have the right, textual recognition of the right to self-determination of nations, nationalities, and peoples. In spite of this gesture towards embracing pluralism in Ethiopia, they still subscribe to that idea that this is one nation and everyone is living here peacefully. And the restatement and reenactment and the attempt to re-enchant the generation into believing that there is one nation tells you that there is some work to be done. But more interestingly, there is another parallel you can draw. In 1915, the dead ruler, Menelik, was governing the country from the grave. In 2015, another dead ruler, Meles Zenawi, the late Meles Zenawi, is ruling the country from the grave. In 1915, a very unlikely successor, an Oromo child of a Muslim dignitary from Wollo, Yasu II, was in power. In 2015, a very unlikely successor, a man from a Walaita descent, the Walaita being the people whose king was not only conquered but also captured and humiliated in the late 19th century by Menelik, and one of the people who faced huge who experienced an atrocity of the highest proportion in the 19th century.
This interview will continue next week.